January 1943. Mid-morning over Western Germany. The sky does not darken all at once. It fills in layers. First, the distant vibration, felt through concrete and steel before it is heard. Then, the thin white scars of contrails, drawn high above the cloud line, straight and disciplined. Minutes later, the sound becomes a single continuous pressure, like weather arriving with intent. In operations rooms from the Ruhr to Berlin, German officers pause over maps already worn thin. Telephones ring without pause. Altitude reports climb higher than expected. Formation counts keep rising. Not dozens. Hundreds. These are not the night bombers they have learned to endure. These aircraft arrive in daylight. They hold their course. They do not scatter. Heavy bombers. American. Long range. Built not for harassment, but for repetition. A German general watches the plotting board fill with symbols that refuse to thin out. Another calculates fuel expenditure and interceptor losses before the first bomb falls. A third, silent, understands something more troubling, that this is not a raid, but a system. Outside, flak opens like black flowers beneath the formations. Inside, the language begins to change. Because for the first time, Germany is no longer reacting to attacks. It is being measured. And that realization leads directly to how the war has reached this moment. By the time the first large American bomber formations crossed the German frontier in force, the war had already hardened Europe into a place of routines and expectations. Germany had been at war since September 1939. By 1942, it had survived years of air attack and had drawn conclusions from them. British bombers came mostly at night. They scattered over cities. They were dangerous, but familiar. Air defenses had adapted. Searchlights, radar control, flak belts, night fighters. Losses were accepted as the price of endurance. The German High Command believed it understood the rhythm of strategic bombing. That belief would not survive the arrival of the United States Army Air Forces. When America entered the war in December 1941, its air doctrine differed sharply from Britain's. U.S. planners had built their strategy around daylight bombing by heavily armed aircraft flying in tight formations. The theory was precise on paper: bomb from high altitude in daylight using optical sights, defend the formation with interlocking machine gun fire, destroy the enemy's industrial heart with accuracy rather than area destruction. German intelligence took note, but did not yet feel threatened. The early American raids of 1942 were small. Limited range forced U.S. bombers to strike targets along the French coast and Western Europe. Losses were noticeable, sometimes severe. German fighter pilots learned the American aircraft were tough but predictable. Generals concluded that daylight bombers, without escort, would bleed. And for a time, they did. But behind the scenes, something different was building. In England, airfields multiplied. Concrete runways stretched across the countryside, warehouses filled with engines, bombs, and spare parts. Entire bomber groups arrived not as replacements, but as additions. The United States did not rotate squadrons, it stacked them. By late 1942 and early 1943, the American heavy bomber force had reached a scale no European power had ever deployed. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were not exceptional as individual machines. What mattered was how many of them existed and how often they returned. German air defense planners began to see the problem in charts and tables. Every interception cost fuel. Every interception cost pilots. Every interception forced the Luftwaffe to choose between defending factories, cities, or the Eastern Front. The bomber formations, meanwhile, kept coming back in nearly identical shapes at predictable altitudes with growing numbers. Daylight removed ambiguity. German generals could watch the threat approach. They could count it. And they could calculate how long their defenses could sustain the exchange. At first, the calculations were optimistic. The bomber box appeared rigid. Fighters could attack head-on from above, from the rear. Flak concentrations could be adjusted. Commanders believed they were watching a phase, one that would peak and then decline under pressure. Yet each month the formations grew thicker. By the spring of 1943, American raids were no longer probing. They were systematic. Ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, submarine yards, targets chosen not for symbolism, but for output. German industry felt the interruptions immediately. Production lines stopped, restarted, then stopped again, and still the bombers returned. German generals began to speak differently in briefings. Less emphasis on repelling raids, more on managing damage, on shifting resources, on deciding what could no longer be fully protected. Because the Americans were not testing Germany's defenses, they were testing Germany's capacity to absorb loss, on both sides. And that realization opens the next layer of the story. By mid-1943, the daylight bombing campaign had crossed a psychological threshold inside the German command structure. The raids were no longer confined to the periphery. American heavy bombers were pushing deep, toward the Ruhr, toward central Germany, toward targets previously considered too costly to attack in daylight. Each penetration forced the Luftwaffe to rise, and each rise exposed the growing imbalance between German resources and American output. What changed the conversation among German generals was not a single raid, but a pattern. Bomber formations no longer thinned as they moved inland. Losses occurred, but not at the rate German planners had expected. Worse, Plaizi or in das Bleichschwur, replacement aircraft appeared faster than defensive tactics could evolve. Reports from air districts described the same problem. Even when fighters broke through, the formations closed ranks and pressed on. Then came the escorts. Early American fighters could not accompany bombers all the way to their targets. German commanders had built their confidence on this limitation. They would attack where the escorts turned back, inflict losses, and break the system. In late 1943 and early 1944, that gap closed. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, most decisively the P-51 Mustang, changed the geometry of the air war. For the first time, German interceptors were engaged before, during, and after contact with the bombers. Airfields became targets. Fighter assembly areas were hunted. Pilots were drawn into combat long before they reached the bomber stream. Inside German operations rooms, the maps grew more crowded, but the margins for decision shrank. February 1944 confirmed the shift. The Americans and British launched a coordinated offensive against the German aircraft industry. The campaign, later known as Big Week, did not aim merely to damage factories. It aimed to force the Luftwaffe into battle and destroy it in the air. German generals recognized the intent almost immediately. Production reports showed paradoxical results. Factories were damaged, but output often recovered. Yet the real losses were not counted in tons of steel or aluminum. They were measured in pilot rosters. Veteran airmen disappeared faster than training schools could replace them. New pilots arrived with fewer hours, less confidence, and almost no margin for error, and the Americans did not ease pressure. Day after day, formations arrived over the same regions. Repair crews worked through the night. By morning, bombers returned. Rail yards were hit again. Oil facilities burned again. Commanders were forced to choose: protect fuel or aircraft plants, cities or transport, frontline units or airfields. German generals began to acknowledge something unspoken. This was no longer a contest of tactics. It was a contest of arithmetic. The United States could afford losses Germany could not. Each bomber shot down represented a fraction of American production. Each German fighter lost carried with it a trained crew, scarce fuel, and irreplaceable experience. Documents and later memoirs show a subtle shift in language during this period. Phrases like repel the raid gave way to limit damage. Air superiority became local containment. The goal was no longer victory in the air, but survival through the next month. By the time Allied forces prepared for invasion in the West, German generals understood the truth with clarity they could not publicly admit. The long-range heavy bomber was not simply a weapon. It was a strategic lever, and its effects reached far beyond bomb craters and factory walls, into leadership decisions, human endurance, and moral strain. Those pressures emerge most clearly when examined from multiple angles. For German civilians, daylight bombing carried a different terror than night raids. At night, destruction arrived unseen. In daylight, it announced itself hours in advance. The distant hum, the rising flak. The sky filled with silver shapes moving with deliberate calm. Civilians could watch the approach and wait. German generals understood the psychological cost almost immediately. Reports from regional commanders described work stoppages not caused by damage, but by fear. Factory shifts broke apart when sirens sounded. Evacuation drills became permanent routines. Entire cities learned to read the sky. Unlike night attacks, daylight raids exposed the mechanics of war. People saw bombs fall from aircraft that seemed untouched, unhurried. This visibility mattered. It eroded confidence in protection. Shelters offered safety from blast, but not from anticipation. Civil defense officials warned the high command morale was becoming a variable that could not be controlled by decree. Generals debated whether the visible nature of the raids strengthened resolve or quietly weakened it. The data suggested the latter. Productivity declined even where factories remained intact. Workers spent more time in shelters than at machines. Cities closest to key targets showed the sharpest drops. The bombers did not need to destroy everything. They needed only to return. In the air, German fighter leaders confronted a problem that defied previous experience. The American bomber formation was not agile. It did not evade. It absorbed. Flying in tight boxes, each aircraft overlapped fields of fire with the next. Approaching fighters faced concentrated defensive gunfire from multiple directions. Losses mounted even during successful attacks. German tactics evolved rapidly. Head-on passes reduced exposure time. Vertical attacks aimed to disrupt formations. Rockets and heavy cannons were introduced to break bomber cohesion. But every solution carried a cost. Heavier weapons reduced maneuverability. Rocket attacks required precise timing. Breaking formation discipline among German units led to confusion and vulnerability to escorts. Combat reports from 1943 reveal a pattern. Tactical successes existed, but they were expensive. Fighters returned damaged. Pilots bailed out over hostile territory. Experienced leaders fell at a rate no training program could match. Generals reviewing these reports noticed something unsettling. Even when bomber losses were high, the missions continued. The formations closed ranks, targets were hit. The bomber box, once dismissed as rigid, proved resilient. Inside the German high command, daylight bombing forced choices that revealed deep fractures. Resources were finite. Fighters sent to defend cities were unavailable at the front. Anti-aircraft guns pulled from coastal defenses weakened other sectors. Fuel diverted to air defense starved training units and armored formations. Senior commanders argued over priorities. Some insisted on defending industrial regions at all costs. Others warned that without air superiority at the front, ground operations would collapse. Hitler's directives complicated the problem. Orders demanded absolute protection of certain cities and facilities, regardless of feasibility. Generals tasked with execution understood the mathematics, but could not openly challenge the political imperative. This tension shaped the language of internal memoranda. Optimism became performative. Reports emphasized effort rather than outcome. Failures were attributed to weather, chance, or temporary shortages. Yet in private conversations and later recollections, German generals admitted the pressure was relentless. Every successful defense consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. They were no longer directing a campaign. They were rationing survival. And these strains deepen when examined through the lenses of industry and enemy assessment. From the perspective of German industry, the bombing campaign produced a dangerous illusion. Factories were hit, but many resumed production within weeks. Albert Speer's ministry became adept at dispersal, rapid repair, and substitution. Output graphs sometimes rose even as ruins still smoked. On paper, this looked like resilience. German generals studied these numbers closely and missed what mattered most. Recovery consumed everything. Skilled labor was pulled from non-essential sectors. Transport capacity was redirected. Temporary fixes replaced durable solutions. Each recovery narrowed the margin for the next strike. The Americans exploited this rhythm. Repeated attacks forced constant restart cycles. Rail hubs were hit again as soon as they reopened. Power stations were targeted not for total destruction, but for disruption. Generals began to realize that survival statistics masked cumulative exhaustion. Industry functioned, but only by sacrificing flexibility. When oil facilities came under sustained attack in 1944, there was no reserve left to adapt. Production did not collapse overnight. It suffocated. Captured documents, post-war interrogations, and memoirs reveal how German generals truly assessed the American bomber threat. There was respect, sometimes grudging, sometimes open, for American organization and persistence. The bombers were seen as less elegant than German designs, but brutally effective as a system. Generals remarked on the discipline of formations and the consistency of operations. More striking was the recognition of American industrial depth. German commanders understood that they were not fighting squadrons or wings. They were fighting an economy. Losses that would cripple the Luftwaffe, barely registered in American planning. New aircraft arrived faster than German intelligence could catalog them. This realization carried a moral weight. Some generals wrestled with the implications of defending cities at the cost of frontline soldiers. Others questioned whether continued resistance in the air served any strategic purpose. These doubts rarely appeared in official documents, but they surfaced after the war with remarkable consistency. The bombing campaign forced German leadership to confront an uncomfortable truth. Bravery and skill could not compensate for imbalance. And that truth became undeniable at a specific moment, when the air war crossed from costly struggle into irreversible decline. That moment forms the climax. Early 1944 marked the point at which German generals stopped asking whether the daylight bombing campaign could be contained, and began asking how long its effects could be delayed. The change was not announced. It emerged in casualty tables, in fuel allocations, in the shrinking lists of experienced pilots available for operations. Each raid stripped away more than metal. It stripped away time. The decisive realization came during the great air battles over Germany in February and March 1944. American bomber streams now arrived with escorts that did not turn back. Fighters ranged ahead of the formations, swept airfields, and waited for interceptors to rise. German pilots found themselves engaged before they reached firing position, and pursued after disengagement. For the Luftwaffe, this reversed the logic of defense. Instead of choosing when and where to attack, German fighters were forced into reaction. Scrambles were hurried, formations broke apart. Pilots, with limited hours, faced veteran enemy crews and aircraft optimized for long-range combat. Losses mounted with a consistency that could no longer be explained away. Generals reviewing after-action reports noticed the same phrases repeating: engaged by escort before contact, unable to regroup, pilot missing. These were not isolated failures, they were systemic. The Americans, meanwhile, showed no sign of restraint. Bomber losses were accepted as operational costs. Missions were flown again over targets already damaged, not because destruction was incomplete, but because pressure had to remain constant. German air defense became a trap of its own making. Every attempt to contest the bomber stream exposed fighters to attrition they could not replace. Training programs were shortened. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. New pilots entered combat with only the most basic preparation. At high command meetings, the tone shifted. No one spoke of stopping the bombers entirely. Instead, discussions focused on protecting specific sectors for limited periods. The language of victory disappeared. The language of endurance took its place. One senior German commander later recalled that by this stage, the question was no longer how to defeat the bomber offensive, but how to preserve enough strength to face the coming invasion. The air war was deciding the ground war before the first Allied soldier set foot on the continent. And still, the bombers came. What followed was the moment when the balance tipped fully, when German generals understood that the Luftwaffe was no longer being worn down, but dismantled. By the spring of 1944, the consequences of the daylight bombing campaign had moved beyond debate and into inevitability. German generals now confronted a reality that no tactical adjustment could reverse. The Luftwaffe still possessed aircraft on paper. It still fielded skilled commanders, but its structure, the invisible network of fuel, pilots, maintenance, and time, was collapsing. The decisive shift lay in oil and airfields. American bombers, supported by long-range escorts, began striking synthetic fuel plants and refineries with increasing frequency. These targets were harder to repair than factories. Damage lingered. Output fell sharply. Fuel rationing tightened across every branch of the German military. Fighter units felt the effects immediately. Training flights were curtailed. Experienced pilots were ordered to conserve fuel, limiting their ability to train replacements. New pilots arrived at the front with dangerously few hours in the cockpit. Commanders noted rising accident rates, aircraft lost without enemy contact. Meanwhile, American fighters roamed freely. They hunted aircraft on the ground. They attacked rail lines feeding air bases. They forced German pilots into defensive postures, even when bombers were not present. The sky itself became hostile. German generals recognized the pattern with clarity that bordered on resignation. The air defense system was no longer eroding gradually. It was unraveling. During staff discussions in mid-1944, senior officers acknowledged that the Luftwaffe could not recover to pre-1943 strength under current conditions. Even total industrial mobilization could not replace lost experience. Even radical designs could not compensate for lack of fuel. The words used in internal assessments were cautious, but unmistakable. Operation sustainable only in limited sectors. Pilot quality declining, enemy air superiority increasing. These were not predictions. They were descriptions. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, German air power was largely absent, not because aircraft did not exist, but because the system that made them effective had been destroyed in advance. The long-range heavy bomber had achieved its purpose, not by annihilation in a single blow, but by pressure applied without pause. For German generals, this realization marked the end of strategic choice in the air. From that point forward, they could respond only locally, temporarily, and at great cost. What followed was the reckoning, measured not just in destroyed cities and factories, but in the narrowing of Germany's options across every front. That reckoning defines the aftermath. The immediate aftermath of the American long-range bombing campaign was not a single collapse, but a permanent state of crisis. German generals now faced a war in which planning horizons had shrunk to days. Transport networks were damaged faster than they could be repaired. Rail junctions reopened only to be struck again. Command posts relocated repeatedly, chasing safety that no longer existed. Industry continued to function, but unevenly. A factory might meet its monthly quota, only to miss the next, entirely due to power outages or fuel shortages. oil distribution became the central concern. Armored units stood idle for lack of fuel, while fighter squadrons rationed sorties to preserve what little remained. Air defense statistics told a grim story. Flak batteries still fired thousands of rounds per raid, but ammunition stocks dwindled. Guns were repositioned constantly, weakening some regions to strengthen others. Fighter units reported growing numbers of aircraft grounded not by damage, but by maintenance delays and fuel scarcity. Most devastating was the human toll within the Luftwaffe. By mid-1944, the cadre of experienced fighter pilots had been largely destroyed. Squadrons existed in name but lacked leaders capable of coordinating complex interceptions. New pilots, brave but undertrained, faced an air environment dominated by enemy fighters. German generals began to describe their air arm not as a shield, but as a series of local reactions, brief, costly, and insufficient. Civil defense reports echoed the strain. Cities endured repeated evacuations. Emergency services were stretched thin. Morale, though officially described as firm, showed signs of deep fatigue. The bombing campaign did not break Germany in one stroke. It forced Germany to live in fragments, and those fragments shaped the final months of the war. As 1944 turned into 1945, the strategic consequences of the long-range American bombing campaign became unmistakable across every front. German generals now operated within narrowing corridors of possibility. Movement by daylight was dangerous. Concentration of forces invited immediate attention from the air. Even when ground units remained intact, their ability to maneuver was crippled by destroyed bridges, disrupted railways, and fuel shortages that could not be solved by improvisation. The air war had reshaped decision-making itself. Plans were no longer built around what might be achieved, but around what could be hidden. Armored counterattacks were postponed or canceled because fuel deliveries failed to arrive. Reinforcements moved at night slowly, often too late. Commanders learned to expect delay as a constant. Post-war interrogations of senior German officers reveal striking consistency. Again and again, they pointed not to a single bombing raid, but to the cumulative pressure, the inability to rest, the impossibility of rebuilding reserves, the knowledge that any recovery would be temporary. One former general described the campaign as a permanent hemorrhage. Another noted that Germany was forced to defend everything, and therefore defended nothing adequately. The daylight bombers had achieved what earlier air campaigns had not. They stripped Germany of initiative. By forcing constant reaction, the bombing campaign ensured that German strategy became fragmented. Resources were scattered. Priorities conflicted. Choices disappeared. By the final months of the war, German generals understood that defeat was no longer a matter of battlefield outcome alone. The structure that sustained warfare, fuel, transport, trained manpower, had been dismantled from above. The long-range heavy bomber did not win the war by itself, but it made all other victories possible. And that realization carries meaning beyond Germany's defeat. It leads directly into reflection. The story of the American long-range heavy bomber is not a story of a single weapon or a single moment of destruction. It is the story of pressure applied without pause, and of leaders forced to confront limits they could not overcome. For German generals, the daylight bombing campaign stripped war of illusion. Skill, courage, and tactical brilliance mattered, but they could not reverse imbalance. Each response consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. Each adaptation narrowed the future. What made the bombers decisive was not their accuracy alone, nor their defensive firepower. It was their integration into a system, escorts that extended reach, intelligence that selected targets, industry that replaced losses, and doctrine that accepted cost in pursuit of outcome. This system changed warfare. It shifted victory away from decisive battles towards sustained dominance. It made air superiority a prerequisite rather than a luxury. It demonstrated that destroying the enemy's ability to fight could matter more than defeating his forces in the field. The human cost remains impossible to ignore. Cities burned, civilians suffered. Air crews on both sides faced extraordinary risk. The moral questions raised by strategic bombing endure because the consequences were real, visible, and lasting. Yet from the perspective of history, the German generals' reactions tell us something essential. They did not describe defeat as sudden or dramatic. They described it as narrowing, choices disappearing one by one until none remained. The long-range heavy bomber did not force surrender in a single blow. It ensured that when the final blows came, there was no strength left to resist them. In that sense, the sky over Germany became more than a battlefield. It became the place where modern war revealed its true shape. A war decided not by surprise, but by endurance.